It was a Halloween night during the week. My parents took my two younger twin brothers out trick-or-treating while I didn't have any plans. So they made me stay home to answer the door and hand out candy to anyone who came by while they were gone. Since our house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, we rarely had any trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Every time the doorbell rang, it startled me. I sat in the living room, watching TV with a bucket of candy on the small table beside me. Butterfingers, the candy my mom always bought for Halloween for some unknown reason. The doorbell rang, so I grabbed the orange bucket and went to answer the door. Standing there was someone wearing a mask and cloak from the movie Scream, holding a pillowcase. He didn't seem to have gotten much candy that night, and it was getting late with hardly anyone else out trick-or-treating. He was alone, which always gave me a bit of a sad feeling, so I gave him a decent amount of candy. He walked away without saying thank you, which made me feel a little bad, but it wasn't a big deal. I didn't think much of it as I sat back down. The movie I was watching ended, so I started flipping through channels. During one brief moment of silence between channels, I heard a noise, a thud and a bump coming from downstairs near the back door. To hear more clearly, I turned the TV volume all the way down and moved closer to the staircase. That's when I noticed the back door was wide open. My heart started racing, and I felt a pit in my stomach. I had forgotten to lock the door earlier when I went outside. The big question now was whether the sound I heard was the door opening or closing, and if someone had entered the house. I called out down the stairs, shouting for my parents and my twin brothers. The silence from the dark basement was unnerving. I didn't dare go down there. Unfortunately, there wasn't a door separating the main floor from the basement stairs, so sitting in the living room suddenly felt very uncomfortable. I kept the TV on, but muted. It made me feel safer with the extra light. After a few moments, it finally occurred to me to call my parents and ask them to come home. My mom said they'd be home in about half an hour. I told her I was scared because I thought someone might be downstairs after hearing a noise. She reassured me that it was probably just my imagination. After hanging up, I immediately heard the sound of wood creaking from one of the carpeted steps leading down to the basement. I froze on the couch, literally unable to move, not even a finger. Then there was another creak. As quietly as I could, I sat up and slowly started tiptoeing toward the front door in a crouched position. But as I passed by the couch, which blocked the view of the basement staircase from the living room, I saw something. A scream mask was peeking up from the stairs, looking right at me, clearly trying not to be seen. The angle and the dim lighting made the sight even more terrifying. But when he realized I had seen him, he quickly retreated back into the darkness of the basement. I rushed upstairs, locked myself in my room, and called my mom again to tell her what had just happened. They immediately cut their trip short and came home. It wasn't until my parents arrived that I felt safe enough to come out of my room. My dad and I checked the entire basement, every closet, every room. Fortunately, there was no one there. The lesson I took away from that night was simple. Always lock your doors, because apparently that stranger had simply let himself in through our back door. This happened in 2016 when I was 15 years old. It was my last time going trick-or-treating for Halloween, so I wanted to make it something special. My mom is pretty laid back, so my plans stretched out over a few days. I planned a sleepover with my two friends, Davis and Zach, the night before Halloween, skipped school the next day to go trick-or-treating, and then finally a sleepover just with my girlfriend, Amber. This story spans across both nights, so I'll try to tell it as fully as possible. My basement had recently been renovated into a man cave, so of course my friends and I decided we'd sleep there. There was a long hallway leading down to the man cave, but the light switch for that hallway didn't work, which made the whole thing feel a bit eerie. However, that only added to the fun that night. My mom had made cookies for us, and we went downstairs. It was around 11 p.m., and we had just finished watching the original Scream movie. The second movie we picked was Paranormal Activity, which none of us had seen before, so that's why I chose it. I remember pausing the movie barely 30 seconds in because the motion sensor light outside in the backyard had turned on. The light lit up the entire room, ruining the creepy atmosphere we had set. So I waited about 30 seconds for the light to go off, then resumed the movie. But after another 30 seconds, the light turned on again, and I started getting frustrated. Davis asked why the light kept turning on, and I said I had no idea. Another 30 seconds passed, the light went off again, and I resumed the movie. At this point, I was determined to figure out what was going on, so I asked Davis and Zach to come with me upstairs to check. They agreed, and we went up to look through the back door. By the time we got there, the light had turned off, so it was hard to see anything. We stood there for about 5 minutes waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. So we went back down to the basement and decided to turn off the movie and just sit around on our phones and chat. We weren't really that into the movie anyway. About 2 hours later, everyone was asleep except for me. I was still on my phone when that familiar glow from the motion sensor light came through the window for the 4th time. I was exhausted, so I just figured it was some kids messing with us. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I decided to check the backyard one last time, and as expected, no one was out there. I gave up and went back to the basement to finally get some sleep. The next night came in the blink of an eye. Before I knew it, my candy bag was full. I felt a bit sad, like this was the end of my childhood. However, I decided to enjoy the night without overthinking it. I still had thoughts about the previous night and wondered whether I should tell Amber or not. She's scared of everything, and I didn't want to ruin our night over a story. We were approaching one of the last houses on our route when Amber suddenly yelled in pain. I asked her what happened, and she said someone had thrown a rock at her. I turned around and saw a man wearing a clown mask standing about 15 feet behind us. This was during the infamous clown epidemic. I told him to get lost, but he just stood there. Looking closer, I realized this guy was an adult man. He was only wearing a clown mask. The rest of his outfit was just regular clothes. We kept walking, but he continued to stand there, watching us. At this point, we decided to call it a night and skip the last few houses out of fear. When we got back to my house, I said goodbye to my friends, and it was just Amber and me, sitting in the basement looking at our candy spread out on the floor. Amber asked if we could watch a movie, so I decided to turn Paranormal Activity back on to finish it. I remember the scene clearly. It was the part where Ma is walking around looking for his girlfriend when suddenly the screen went black, and the dim basement lights went out too. Amber and I looked at each other, and I realized the power had gone out. This immediately made me nervous, because the power at my house had never gone out unless there was a storm. I checked my weather app, and it showed that the conditions were perfectly normal that night. No rain at all. I told Amber to stay in the basement, but she was scared and wanted to come upstairs with me to check what was going on. The generator for the house was located in the backyard, and at that moment, I got a bad feeling in my stomach. Thoughts from the previous night started creeping back into my mind, and this time, Davis and Zach weren't with me, and Amber wasn't very strong. All the worst scenarios played out in my head as I slid open the door to the backyard. All I could hear were crickets chirping. I thought maybe I was just overthinking. Amber and I walked past the motion light, but it didn't turn on. I was about 5 feet away from the generator when I heard a twig snap. Amber and I turned toward the forest at the far end of the yard. All we could hear were crickets, but we felt like we were being watched. I felt like I was going to throw up. I decided it was better to stay in the house with no lights than to stay out here. Amber started heading inside, and that's when I saw him, the guy with the clown mask standing by the shed. We just stared at each other for a moment, then suddenly he leaped forward and started sprinting toward us. I ran inside and slammed the door shut after Amber. We ran down to the basement and hid behind the bar. That's when I realized I had forgotten to lock the back door. And then we heard a loud bang from upstairs. Everything in the basement went completely silent. Amber started texting 911 because she was too scared to talk. She explained that there was an intruder in the house. Time dragged on. It must have been 10 minutes at most, but it felt like hours. And then I heard the sound I dreaded most, the basement door opening. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs and down the hallway. Amber was breathing too loudly, so I had to cover her mouth. The footsteps got closer to where we were and stopped. I started thinking that if he found us, I'd have to fight him. I grabbed a beer bottle from behind the bar and braced myself. The room stayed silent for what felt like forever, and then we heard police sirens from outside. I realized this was the perfect moment to act. In a split second, I stood up, charged at him, and swung the bottle at his head. But I tripped and fell to the floor. When I looked up, I saw the man in the clown mask standing over me. I think the mask absorbed some of the blow because he barely flinched. I realized this had been a bad idea because it seemed like he was about to head back upstairs after hearing the sirens. He looked down at me, and I felt like my life could end right then and there. But then we heard the police sirens again. He stood still for a second before running up the stairs. Then we heard the back door open and slam shut again. I ran upstairs to let the police in and told them he had run out back. And in case you're wondering, no, to my knowledge, the police never caught that guy. Since then, I haven't been able to go down to the basement alone without feeling anxious, even to this day. We started hanging out at Amber's place for a while after that. All I can do is look back and feel grateful that we're still alive. I'll never forget the feeling of looking up and seeing that clown mask staring down at me as I lay on the floor. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. It was Halloween weekend, and this year it landed on a Saturday. My mom always goes all out when it comes to decorating and handing out candy to kids. It's almost like she's competing with the neighbors to have the most popular house for trick-or-treaters. Our house is on a corner lot in a typical suburban neighborhood, so when we decorate, we have to do the side of the house too. Since Halloween was on a Saturday, the kids started trick-or-treating earlier in the day, but it was a cloudy, cold day, and there was rain in the forecast. My mom didn't seem to realize that the weather might be why not many kids were coming by. After a few trick-or-treaters passed by our house, she decided that it was because we didn't have enough decorations to draw them in. She told me to go up to the attic and get whatever Halloween decorations were left. I tried to tell her it wasn't necessary, but she insisted. So I went up to the attic, which is right above my bedroom. The attic door is in the hallway upstairs. I pulled down the door and climbed up the ladder. We had our holiday decorations organized pretty well, so I went over to where the Halloween stuff was. There were only a few boxes left. I opened one to see what was inside and figured it was good enough. I started pulling the box toward the attic door and carefully slid it down the ladder. Just as I was about to climb down, I thought I heard a noise on the other side of the attic, like wood creaking under some pressure. I looked over to the far corner where the boxes were stacked, but it's an attic, so a creaky noise wasn't all that unusual. I climbed down and brought the decorations downstairs. Then, my mom and I put out a few more things in the front yard. It was really windy, and it looked like it could rain any minute. Hardly any kids were out trick-or-treating, and my mom seemed disappointed since she had prepped so much candy. She's one of those people who makes little homemade goodie bags with a variety of candy in them. I could tell she was upset about not being able to give them out. The day dragged on, and I went back to my room to play games on my laptop while my mom stayed downstairs in the living room and kitchen, waiting for the few trick-or-treaters who might show up. Then it started to rain, making the day even more of a bust. While I was gaming, I heard another creak from above in the attic for the second time that day. It wasn't too strange, but I noted it. It rained all day, and by nightfall it turned into a full-on thunderstorm, perfect for Halloween night. As a teen, I was really into gaming, so instead of going out on a Saturday night, I'd usually stay in playing video games. That night was no exception. I stayed up late, long after my parents had gone to bed. The rain continued to pour outside. Then I heard it again, this time sounding more like footsteps. I wondered if my mom was in the attic putting stuff away, but it was really late. I sat there and listened for a while. The noise stopped. I paused my game and stepped out into the hallway. A few minutes later, I noticed the attic door was open. Then I heard noises coming from downstairs in the kitchen, like someone rummaging through the fridge. My heart started pounding. I tiptoed down the hallway to my parents' room and quietly opened the door. When I saw both of them fast asleep, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I quietly shut the door and went over to wake my dad. He woke up easily, and I whispered, "There's someone in the house." He immediately sat up and asked, "What?" I said, "There's someone in the kitchen right now, going through the fridge. I think they're hiding in the attic." My dad isn't a big or confrontational guy. He keeps a police baton under his bed in case of emergencies, but I don't think he ever imagined having to use it. He told me to stay quiet. Then he went to check the hallway. When he came back, he whispered that he had seen someone climbing into the attic. He locked the bedroom door and called 911. By now, my mom was awake too, but we all stayed as quiet as possible and tried not to panic. It became a waiting game until the police arrived. My dad went downstairs to unlock the front door. The attic door was now closed. The police had to go inside and search the attic, where they found a homeless-looking man hiding behind a wall of boxes. The noises I had been hearing all day were, in fact, coming from a person. The man, while dirty and a bit scary-looking, was very upfront and honest. He explained that he had walked in when he saw our front door was left open the day before, and he had nowhere to sleep. He had taken one of our blankets and even had a jar of peanut butter up there that he was eating. The whole thing still creeps me out, and I wonder what would have happened if my dad or I had confronted the guy instead of letting the police handle it. My parents decided not to press charges. Halloween used to be one of my favorite holidays, but now I only really get excited about it if there's a great party to go to. In 2018, when I was a senior in college, my friend Tracy told me her sorority was throwing a big Halloween party at the sorority house. She said I could bring one friend since they didn't want too many outsiders at the party, so I invited my best friend Cody. We're usually the type to wait until the last minute for Halloween costumes. The party was that night, and we still didn't have anything. Cody was working late, so he asked me to get a costume for him, and he'd Venmo me the money afterward. I rushed over to the Spirit Halloween store near my house, only about 5 minutes away. I was in a hurry to pick something. I grabbed a Where's Waldo costume for myself and a Superman costume for Cody. Both of them were on the cheaper side. Everything was normal until I got to the register. While I was checking out, I was on the phone with Cody, telling him about the costume I got him and giving him details about the party. I told him which sorority had invited us, gave him the address, and then he convinced me to pick him up instead of meeting at the party. Just casual conversation. All of this was happening as the cashier stared at me. The guy looked quite a bit older than me, but because of his receding hairline, I couldn't tell if he was in his 30s or 40s. He was wearing glasses, had a skinny build, and gave off an awkward vibe. While ringing up the two costumes, he made a comment like, "Sounds like you've got a fun party tonight, huh?" I laughed and said, "Yeah, I guess." Then he started asking more questions, like whether it was an open invite, and made a comment about there being lots of girls. I told him it was invite only and that I barely got in myself. He nodded and said it was cool, then shook my hand and introduced himself as Mike. So I shook his hand and said my name was Sean, then left. The whole thing was just weird. Fast forward to that night, I picked up Cody and we arrived at the party around 10 p.m. It was loud inside and several groups of people were entering ahead of us. At the door, a girl asked who we knew there, and I told her Tracy. She let us in and we stepped into a huge living room with loud music, dimmed lights, Halloween decorations everywhere, and of course, people holding red cups full of booze packed into the place. We found Tracy and hung out with her for a while. We played beer pong and other drinking games. It was a legit party. But at some point, there was a commotion near the front door. Cody, Tracy, and I, along with a few others, went to check it out, and the girl at the door started calling out, "Where's Tracy?" Tracy came forward, and the girl asked, "Who's Sean?" I replied, "That's me." She then asked who the creepy guy we invited was. I was confused and said, "Who?" She described an older guy in a cowboy costume with a fake mustache. Apparently, he had inappropriately touched one of the girls, tried pulling her into a separate room, and she screamed for help. Then he took off with something in his pocket. No one chased after him or anything. Right away, I thought of the cashier from Spirit Halloween. I told everyone about it, and they all got even more freaked out. The party continued, but they were much more careful about who they let in. They even considered calling the cops for a moment. The whole situation killed my vibe, and we didn't stay much longer after that. In total, we were probably there for a few hours. I think we left shortly after midnight. I didn't drink much. When I started my car, a car parked about 2 spaces behind us also started up. As I drove toward Cody's house, the car began following us. Cody and I were sure it had to be him, especially after the car made 4 of the same turns as us. I pulled over to see if they'd do the same, but the car just stopped for a few seconds. It then suddenly sped past us. We didn't get a good look at who was inside, but I'm still convinced it was him. After dropping Cody off a block away from his house to be cautious, I stayed very alert. That's when I noticed a car in the distance with its lights off, and it looked like the same one from earlier. When I got to a main road, I pulled over again and waited. The car waited for a few seconds, then turned on its lights and sped off in the far left lane. By then, I was really freaked out and drove home as fast as I could, making sure I wasn't being followed. The next day, I called the Spirit Halloween store to report the cashier. They thanked me for the information, but I never went back, so I don't know if he was fired or anything. Looking back, I wonder if I could have or should have pressed charges. Either way, I don't know what he was after, but I'm just glad he didn't find out where I live. It was a stormy Halloween night. I was with my 3 friends, John, Mary, and Keenan. Since we didn't have any specific plans and were just hanging around, I decided to pull out the Ouija board from my closet. Everyone was excited to try it. To make things a bit more fun and spooky, I lit 3 candles and turned off all the lights. The 4 of us sat around the table, placing our hands on the planchette. We started by asking, "Is anyone there?" The planchette immediately started to move, and we all burst into laughter. It moved from Y to E to S, spelling yes. John and I started asking silly questions like, "Are you going to haunt Mary?" She kept begging us to stop, but when the planchette moved again to spell yes, we couldn't stop laughing. Honestly, I didn't even help move the planchette. I just assumed John and Keenan were messing around. Without anyone asking anything, the planchette began to move on its own, spelling out the words, "I'm inside the house." We all kept laughing until a loud, clear thud came from upstairs, directly above us, like someone stomping their foot on the floor. We all jumped in fright. Mary started screaming, panicking. John, Keenan, and I didn't know whether to laugh or be scared. My parents weren't home, and it was just me in the house. We didn't have any pets either. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. We all looked at each other, and I went to peek through the peephole. I opened the door. Standing there was a father and his young son, trick-or-treating under an umbrella in the rain. I handed the kid some candy and closed the door, but my mind was still focused on figuring out what that noise was. I convinced everyone to go upstairs with me to check. We walked down the hallway upstairs, which was lit by a small nightlight plugged into the floor outlet. We headed toward my parents' bedroom, the room directly above the table where we were sitting when we heard the noise. That's when we all heard the same thing. A girl's voice. None of us could make out what she said, but we all agreed that we heard a girl's voice in my parents' room, followed by something dropping onto the floor. Mary and Keenan ran downstairs, terrified but completely silent. John and I, however, bravely approached the door. I gently opened it and slowly pushed it wide. In the darkness, I saw a tall figure standing in the far corner of the room. I slammed the door shut, and we both bolted down the stairs. We returned to the living room and turned on all the lights. That's when we noticed that one of the 3 candles next to the Ouija board had gone out. I decided to call the police, and a few minutes later, an officer arrived. I asked him to check my parents' room. We led him upstairs and pointed at the door. He knocked, announced, "Police," then quickly opened the door and turned on the light. He checked the closet, under the bed. Nothing. We all entered the room behind him, and I can confirm that no one was there. While we were at it, we checked all the bedrooms and bathrooms upstairs. There was no possible place for anyone to hide. After the officer left, we threw the Ouija board in the neighbor's trash can, then sat under the awning in the backyard, quietly listening to the rain until my parents came home. After telling my parents the whole story, my friends gradually went home. My parents seemed to believe us, but what could they really do? I didn't sleep well that night, and I'm sure I'll never use a Ouija board again. Halloween 2016, my 3 close friends, let's call them J, K, and L, and I went trick-or-treating in the downtown area. The area was always bustling during Halloween since the houses were so close to each other, meaning we could collect a lot of candy without having to walk too far. By around 10 p.m., things began to wind down, and by 10:30, we were pretty much the last kids still out trick-or-treating. Only about 1 in 10 houses still had their lights on, so we decided to call it quits on trick-or-treating and start messing around. After all, it was a Saturday night. Just as we stopped collecting candy, we saw a person dressed as a clown slowly emerging from the dark fog in the distance. This was a very realistic clown costume. The makeup was incredibly creepy, from the slit mouth to the blood-filled boils. It was really scary. We all laughed and screamed a little, but ultimately, we kept walking. We headed to a nearby park to continue messing around, spraying silly string and shaving cream. But we weren't the first ones there. The playground was covered in silly string, and shaving cream was smeared across the bathroom walls with some vulgar words written on them. As we were sitting in the playground, Jay pointed toward the dark horizon, where we saw 2 clowns walking toward us, one of them being the same clown we saw earlier. I didn't think anything could be creepier, but the second clown was even scarier than the first. The first clown now seemed to be holding a long, spear-like object. They both walked slowly, approaching us. The humor of the situation quickly faded as they got closer. Then, suddenly, they started sprinting toward us. We all scattered in different directions. One of the clowns started chasing me, running out of the park and down the street. I kept running and didn't stop. I wasn't very familiar with the area, but I knew how to get to Elle's house, so I ran straight there. About halfway, I managed to lose the clown. I called Elle and told him I was in his backyard. He was out of breath and said he had just escaped one of the clowns and was heading home. I said I'd call Jay and Elle would call Kay. Luckily, Jay answered on the first ring. He wasn't being chased, so he didn't sound as freaked out as Elle. I told him to meet us at Elle's house. About 10 minutes later, all 4 of us were gathered in Elle's backyard, sitting around and talking about what had just happened. We all burst out laughing now that it was over, eating some of the candy we'd collected. Kay went home after a while, and the 3 of us, Jay, Elle, and I, hung out in the living room for a bit. The lights were off, the TV was on, and we were playing some Xbox One games. Jay looked out the window and suddenly ducked down, telling us to turn off the TV. When we asked why, he said there was a clown outside. I didn't believe him, so I peeked out the window. Jay yelled, "Don't," but it was too late. The clown standing outside Elle's house was staring directly at me through the window. I quickly pulled the curtain shut and told Elle that Jay wasn't joking. Elle's parents weren't home, so we couldn't go to them for help. Instead, we turned off the TV and went up to Elle's bedroom. When we looked out the window, the clown was gone. In fact, we never saw either of the clowns again. But the next morning, Elle texted the group, saying he found a rubber clown nose placed on the table in his backyard. He said it was clearly put there to scare us, and it had worked because we were definitely freaked out. Thankfully, that clown epidemic didn't last more than a month. It just became an old story after that. When I was 18, I threw a Halloween party at my parents' house. It was an invite-only party, meaning I asked everyone not to bring any strangers. That was one of my parents' rules. They were out of town that weekend, which gave me the opportunity to host the party, with the condition that the house had to be cleaner than before once the party was over. I invited about 50 people, and around 40 showed up. The party started at 6 p.m., right when the evening started to set in. The party took place partly in the backyard and partly on the first floor. My parents left me money to buy drinks like sodas and snacks to set up in the kitchen for everyone to help themselves. I told my parents it would be a dry party, but I think they knew that wasn't exactly true. A friend of mine, a few years older than me, brought his DJ equipment to play music. And by the time it got dark, the party was really in full swing. It seemed like everyone followed the rule about not bringing strangers because I recognized everyone who came in. Most people greeted me when they arrived. I didn't drink much because I wanted to stay somewhat responsible as the host, but as the night went on, others were getting more and more drunk. Eventually, one of my friends came up to me after grabbing food and asked about a guy in a skeleton bodysuit that was inside the house. I didn't recall seeing anyone wearing that, so I went inside and asked a few people if they had noticed someone in a skeleton costume. One person said, "Yeah, it seemed like he was snooping around." Hearing that made me uneasy, so I asked if anyone had invited him or knew who he was. Nobody did. I started looking around and soon saw him coming down the stairs. I asked, "Who are you?" And he responded, "Mike, I just used the bathroom upstairs." His voice was deep, and he sounded older. His build was large, not muscular, just solid. I asked, "Who invited you?" And he said, "Tom." I didn't know anyone named Tom, so I asked, "Who's Tom?" Then I asked him to take off his mask. He ignored me, didn't say anything, and just walked past me towards the front door, then left. I ran upstairs to check if any rooms had been gone through or if anything was missing. All the doors upstairs were closed except for the bathroom, and after a quick check, nothing seemed to be stolen. I locked the front door and told a few of my friends about the strange encounter. I went outside to ask a few more friends if they knew anything about the guy in the skeleton costume, but no one did. Eventually, I let it go. By around midnight, the party was winding down and most people were heading out. A few close friends stayed a little longer to help clean up. When everything was done, I considered the party a success. Once everyone had left, I started getting ready for bed. One of my friends, Vinny, was staying over and crashed on the couch downstairs. After brushing my teeth and changing into pajamas, I decided to hang out with Vinny in the living room for a bit. We had a couple of drinks and watched some funny YouTube videos on the TV. My little sister, who was 14, had been asleep for a while by then. She didn't join the party because she was too young. We were being quiet so we wouldn't wake her up, but when Vinny and I both heard noises from upstairs, we assumed she was awake. I waited to hear the usual sounds of her heading to the bathroom or something. But I got confused when I didn't hear her door open. I decided to go upstairs to check on her. I knocked on her door, but there was no response. When I opened it slightly, I saw that she was still asleep. So what were those noises I had been hearing? I walked over to my parents' room and noticed their door wasn't fully shut. I could push it open without even turning the knob, which was strange because I remembered making sure it was closed before the party. I peeked inside without turning on the light. As I backed out of the room, I glanced through the crack in the door and saw the guy in the skeleton bodysuit. There was no mistaking it. I knew exactly what I was seeing. I'm pretty proud of myself for not screaming or running. I acted like I didn't see him and quietly closed the door. Then I went back downstairs and told Vinny that the guy from earlier was still in the house. I had him call 911 to report a break-in, while I snuck back upstairs to my sister's room, woke her up, and explained what was happening. I told her to stay quiet and follow me downstairs. She did a great job not panicking. When we got downstairs, we met Vinny in the kitchen by the back door, and we all went out to the backyard. We cut around the side of the house to the front and went to a neighbor's house, ringing the doorbell at least 3 times. The neighbor let us in to wait for the police. Somehow, before the police arrived, that guy had escaped through my parents' bedroom window. I know because the window was open. Their closet door was also open, where my dad kept his safe. It seemed like whoever the guy was, he knew about the safe and had tried to break into it or steal the whole thing. It was obvious how he had gotten into the house. He had simply walked in during the party. Whoever he was, we never found out. But it was clear that he knew I was having a party, was older, and knew about my parents' safe. My sister eventually told our parents about it, and of course, that was the last party I was ever allowed to throw at their house. Halloween in 2019 was the scariest night of my life. I live in Australia, and since Halloween isn't celebrated that much here, we don't get many trick-or-treaters. Maybe 5 or 6 kids at most. Personally, I love Halloween, even though my parents aren't that into it and would rather not bother with the holiday at all. So I take on the responsibility of decorating the house and handing out candy to the kids. That year, Halloween fell on a weeknight, and a storm rolled in just after 6 p.m., which basically meant all my decorating efforts were pretty much wasted. Even so, I decided to stay in the living room, hoping someone might show up for candy, and watched The Conjuring to pass the time. About an hour and a half later, I got a message from my friend M in our group chat, asking if anyone wanted to go out trick-or-treating. At first, I was surprised we hadn't gone trick-or-treating in over 5 years, but I figured it would make the night more fun, since no one had knocked on the door anyway. My other friends, who I'll call S, C, and H, all agreed and asked M where we should meet up. M quickly responded that he couldn't make it, which was weird since he was the one who suggested going trick-or-treating in the first place, but he mentioned a house that supposedly had a lot of candy. S, C, H, and I all arrived at the house within half an hour. There was a big table on the front porch with a pumpkin-shaped bowl filled with lollipops, and after checking the windows to make sure no one was watching us, we divided the candy up, only leaving a few behind to avoid suspicion. As we turned to leave, we were greeted by 2 men dressed as clowns coming up the driveway. They had huge painted smiles and tilted heads. I could tell we were all freaked out, and one of my friends screamed when they suddenly started sprinting toward us, with one of them squeaking his rubber nose while chasing us. We ran like crazy, feeling like it took forever, but we finally lost them. We decided to head to M's house to talk about what just happened in a safer place. However, when M opened the door, he burst into laughter. "What are you guys doing?" he asked, clearly confused. "You told us to go trick-or-treating. Can we come inside now?" S responded. Once we sat down on M's couch, we found out that M had actually lost his phone earlier in the day. It seemed like some stranger had texted us, luring us to that house. It was probably a trap set by the clowns. After about half an hour, I cautiously made my way home around 9:30, finished my movie, and went outside to collect the candy bowl I had set up. I was shocked to find the bowl completely empty. But the part that truly scared me was the clown nose lying in the bowl. I told my parents everything that had happened and showed them the clown nose someone had left. They reassured me that it was just a Halloween prank. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something hitting my bedroom window, like rocks being thrown at the glass. Despite being scared out of my mind, my curiosity got the better of me. Eventually, I opened the blinds. My Halloween decorations had been destroyed and were scattered across the ground below. I stood there frozen in shock until a lollipop hit the window, snapping me out of it. I looked up and saw them. 2 clowns perched on my neighbor's roof, staring down at me. I screamed and ran straight to my parents' room. I won't go into all the details of what happened next, but the police were called, and the clowns weren't found. The police told us they would check out the house where my friends and I had gone trick-or-treating, and they left about half an hour later. The next morning, we were informed that the house was abandoned and M's phone was found inside. At school that day, I learned that M, S, C, and H had all experienced creepy things that night too. I don't know if the clowns followed us home, or if they somehow tracked us through M's phone. All I know is that Halloween is only a few weeks away, and I'm absolutely terrified they might come back. My older brother was hosting a Halloween party. He was a sophomore in college, while I was only in 8th grade. Since our parents were away for the weekend, he took advantage of the opportunity to throw a party. He made it very clear that he didn't want me around while the party was happening. But luckily, I already had plans to go trick-or-treating with 2 of my friends. We all agreed this would probably be our last year trick-or-treating, so we wanted to make it a memorable night. We started trick-or-treating in the early afternoon, right after school, prime time when most kids were out. Almost every house answered their door, and there was still plenty of candy left. By the time it got dark, each of us had already filled up 2 bags of candy, and of course, we made stops at home in between to drop them off. But that wasn't enough for us. We wanted more. After dinner and a break at one of my friends' houses, we headed back out with empty bags and flashlights. You'll see why the flashlights were necessary soon. It was probably around 9 o'clock by then. The pace of collecting candy had slowed down because most of the candy bowls were empty, and not all houses were answering their doors anymore. An hour passed by quickly since we were still having fun, even though we didn't get much candy this time. By the time it was around 10:30 or 11, we decided to stop since knocking on doors that late felt rude. Everyone had already gone home because it was a Tuesday night, people had work, and kids had school the next day. But we had already decided we'd be skipping school the next day. We all had the same homeroom and knew nothing important was happening. So to us, the night was still young. So we decided to head to the Ghoul House, as the locals called it. This house had a creepy history. A couple had divorced after their child died in the house, and then the wife moved out. A few weeks later, the husband shot himself at the kitchen table. Ever since then, the house had been fenced off. Why it hadn't been sold or torn down yet was a mystery to me. When we arrived, we realized how much scarier the house looked in the dark. It was taller than the other houses, with a black fence around the front yard and overgrown bushes crowding it. The front gate was easy to hop over. The thrill of what we were doing made it all the more exciting. We decided to sneak around to the back, hoping no neighbors would spot us. The back windows were boarded up from the inside, and the back door was blocked by a table. Someone, probably a neighbor, had clearly tried hard to keep people out. Working together, we carefully lifted the table off the door and set it down on the grass. The door didn't have a doorknob and it pushed open easily. We stepped inside, feeling both uneasy and excited at the same time. All of us had flashlights, which provided enough light in the otherwise pitch-black house. We were in the back living area of the house, a sort of den. The wooden floors creaked loudly underfoot, and it seemed like everything had been left untouched for years. It didn't look like anyone had broken in before us. There wasn't much to see in that room, so we moved on to the kitchen. An old, decrepit fridge sat in the corner. One of my friends opened it, and immediately the room filled with a stale, rotting, plasticky smell. Inside the fridge were just a few empty cartons of milk and orange juice. That was it. The kitchen reeked so badly that we quickly got out of there. Next up was the living room, and this room was just plain eerie. There was something about it that made you feel like if you turned around, there might be someone standing in one of the corners. One of my friends pointed his flashlight upwards and said, "Look at that." There was a giant hole in the ceiling, leading straight up to a room upstairs. As we all shined our lights up there, we heard a few thumps coming from right above us. We immediately shut off our flashlights. I got that terrible, gut-wrenching feeling in my chest from what we had just heard. We whispered to each other, confirming that those were definitely footsteps. One friend whispered that we should go upstairs to check it out, but my other friend and I quickly refused and began tiptoeing toward the back door. But he wouldn't give up. He didn't follow us. Instead, he went upstairs, not even trying to be quiet about it. Now we felt like we had no choice but to wait for him in the living room, so we stayed put. We heard his footsteps upstairs as he moved across the house, stopping directly above us. By this point, my eyes had adjusted to the dark, so even without the flashlights, I could make out the figure of my friend standing above us, looking down through the hole in the ceiling. I tried whispering loud enough for him to hear, but he didn't seem to. I didn't want to speak any louder. Then, all of a sudden, we heard footsteps coming from the stairs in the living room. Both of us turned on our flashlights and aimed them at the top of the staircase where we saw our friend walking down. The realization hit us instantly, but neither of us had the guts to shine our flashlights up toward the hole to see who had been standing there. I just yelled, "Run!" and we all bolted for the back door, sprinting out of the house and back to one of my friend's homes. The friend who had gone upstairs said that he smelled something foul up there, like a rotting carcass, and that he also heard breathing coming from one of the rooms. To this day, we still don't know who was in that house, but it seems unlikely it was just another curious explorer, given how sealed off the house was. Needless to say, we never went back there again.